I guess you could say history's being made on the Belated Binge podcast today, and I'm celebrating a significant milestone and achievement, which I'll share in more detail later after I bring on my special guest. If you're still a Harry Potter fan in 2023, you're going to know this name. It's Eric Scull of MuggleCast. Welcome to Belated Binge Harry Potter, the re-binge podcast that doesn't take itself or the books too seriously. I'm Zach, your host, and today is part one of my conversation with Eric, where we're exploring the Potterhead fandom through the ages with one of the most prominent creators within it. So strap in for Harry Potter, A History.
The Belated Binge Podcast.
Before we jump in, spoilers, obviously. Language, probably. Shout out to Alex and Katie of the Bonus Binge Squad over on Patreon. Eric, please say hi and let people know you're not being held against your will.
Hello. For those watching the video, I am not blinking excessively, which means that I am not being held against my free will. I think I said there wasn't a double negative in there. Hi, I'm Eric. It's a pleasure, Zach, to finally be a part of this show.
Likewise, this is awesome for a whole lot of reasons that I'm going to get into in just a second, because I didn't tell you that you're coming on for a particularly special episode for this podcast. So if you will indulge me for a second, I would love to go into a brief teeny tiny story time before we make the rest of the episode essentially about you and Harry Potter.
Okay.
So when I started this podcast well over 2 years ago now, somehow I had a handful of goals that I wanted to achieve with the podcast. And with most of them, yeah, I'm nowhere close. But today, this is a super special episode because I've officially achieved one of the biggest goals that I've had on my list. So you could say, if I never recorded another episode again, hopefully that's not the case, Belated Binge would officially be a success as of right now.
Oh, wow.
Would you like to hear about the goal?
I would like to hear the goal.
So before I ever posted an episode, became a creator in the space, I was a consumer of the space, and I made a pie in the sky, like, dream collaboration list of 3 guest targets of Potterless, Super Carlin Brothers, and MuggleCast. And on top of that, I had a choice creator from all of those things that would be like my dream collaboration, and you were the top of that list. So
Wow.
the reason I didn't tell you that you were coming on for a major milestone episode of the podcast is you're kind of the milestone. So before we actually get started, I did want to say thank you for coming on. On the list of things that you've done in the fandom, this is going to mean nothing to you, but for me, it means a ton.
False.
So thank you.
That is incredibly kind. That is so incredibly kind, and it means so much that you said that. And I am really, really happy to be. I was happy to come on. I was happy to be asked and invited on. I think it's awesome that what you're doing, what you said about being a consumer before being a creator, is 100% the way that I believe this all works. I've been wary over many years of like creative stagnation, of like, am I just consuming too much? Should I be creating more? And it's hard to kind of switch gears sometimes. And it's also hard to make something that's yours, that you can be passionate about, that you keep coming back to. And so all of that resonates. And yeah, I'm just incredibly thrilled that you've met one of your goals, and very humbled that one of them was just me having me on a show, because it's really easy. You could reach out anytime. Others can reach out anytime, and if I'm free, I will make it happen. But this that's very special. So thank you.
No, thank you. This is awesome. And now I've sufficiently kissed your ass and made everyone involved uncomfortable. Let's talk a little bit about why. Like, let's start with like the elevator pitch. Your podcast is a literal legal adult at this point. How
It is.
how did you get to that, and like how are you still talking about Harry Potter for 18 years?
It's a common question whenever we say we're still here. Actually, many people who originally listened and who happened to fall off over the years find us again on social or whatever, and are
I'm
like,
one of them.
you guys are still you fell off in the middle there somewhere?
Well, so I found you all when I jumped into Harry Potter as a middle of my I think I was 25.
Uh-huh.
And I found you like immediately thereof. And so I listened for like 3 or 4 years, kind of didn't consume much for a couple,
Mhm.
and then jumped back in
Mhm.
and went back with you, and I'm like, they're still doing the thing.
Still
And
doing the thing.
um I think I even jumped back to some of the chapter by chapters that you had done like years prior, because you all went out of order the first time. And
Yeah, yeah.
it was audio quality in what, 2015 and whatnot was very different.
Well, much better than 2005.
That's true.
We were, I
That's
think,
true.
originally we were on either USB headsets or old microphones that plugged into the audio ports instead of the USBs. You know, they weren't even high tech, or, and because of that, Audacity would always crash. We'd lost episodes. There were many pitfalls along the way. But yeah, so the question was, how are we still finding things to
Right.
talk about?
Right.
Yeah, it's crazy because for the majority of its lifespan, MuggleCast has been weekly. So there's also that, because the frequency of podcasts can vary. Now what I think is really awesome that people are doing is like seasons of their show. And so they'll do, a dedicated set of 12 or 15 or fewer episodes, and then they're off for like several months, because these days the podcasting sphere is so like robust too that people like won't leave you forever. If you go out of regularity, it's like, okay, I'll keep that on my subscribed list, and I have 50 other podcasts that I want to listen to. So it's like, okay, that's great. But no, we've pretty much kept up. I mean, except for a period of time in like I think 2013-ish, when we like ended the show for we're like, yeah, everyone, we're going away, and I think it was like 270 episodes in. That really represented what we thought was a slowing down, and like Harry Potter was never over. We were like, we're never going to say never to return again, but we've exhausted all the content. That was the moment where we said, we have talked about everything Harry Potter wise. And it wasn't true in certain circumstances. We never had gone through, I think, books 5 and 6, which is why we did those more recently on chapter by chapter, when we sort of came back to doing that as a regular segment. There were some things we could have done, but all the movies had come out, all the books had come out. We had done years, 7 or 8 or more years of speculation, and it was just kind of a natural closing. So we ended the show, and within I think 2 weeks, the Fantastic Beasts movies were announced, as well as Cursed Child, an upcoming stage play on Broadway. And we had to do a quick about face. We were like, just kidding, we're back. So to answer your question, I think, in a less roundabout way, like, it ebbs and flows, and there is like, we changed the frequency when things got rough. So even though we've mostly been weekly, when we decided that we were coming back, it's not like we immediately could see Fantastic Beasts, right? It had just been announced. I didn't even think it was in more than like the first stages of production at the time. So while we were back regular, we were monthly, or less. I think there was actually a whole year where there were maybe fewer than 10 episodes of MuggleCast.
Oh,
Don't
wow.
quote me, I could certainly look it up, but that was like the slow year. That was the year before we like, Cursed Child had been announced, but before we could see it, before we really knew much about it. And then when we started our Patreon in 2016, which again like coincided kind of with some of that getting back into things, it feels like we really have had no time off. But there was very much a difference in trying to produce a MuggleCast episode monthly versus trying to produce an episode weekly. And really, we've just always been guided by what part of the fandom are we engaging with. Are we looking to have on people do fan art, fanfic, wizard rock? There's still all these untapped, like, we've done episodes on each of those topics, but we haven't really done deep dives, and there's still that like possibility. So for the most part, We've been vibing with whatever movie was coming out. We've been vibing with general fandom news, because that's kind of like the origins of the MuggleCast. So we've managed, but something that gave us a boost recently when we did go back to doing chapter by chapter episodes was the fact that it had been 15 years since we first did them. And when we started the show, we were teenagers, and a teenager reads even young adult and children's books way differently than an adult does. And so the new and fresh perspective meant that even if we did go back through the same chapters, we would not be repeating ourselves, which I think is very important, because all of the episodes we've ever had are on our feed, and they're all still available if anybody wanted to like double up on chapter episodes, especially for the first 3 books. You could and the MuggleCast website. It would be so interesting, but nobody has said that they've like done it. Like if you listen to, I think it's like episode 32 of MuggleCast, like 032, and now we're on 624. But 032 is when we started chapter by chapter, and I think it was with book 1. And if you go back to like episode like 580 or something was when we started book 1 again. It's like 15 years apart or more, of actually closer to 16 or 17 years apart, of like the same chapter from the same people but different perspectives. And it'd be like wild, but that's how we justify it, is that it's different enough. And so we're covering a lot of the same ground, but something about the Harry Potter books and why they were, I think, successful, and how they're in our minds always, is that every time you go back reading, even if it's only been a year since you last read that book, you find something new. It's complicated enough, it's detailed enough, it's resonating on a slightly different frequency each time you go through, and that the richness of the text means that it is something that you can do a podcast that's like literary analysis and never really run out of ideas or topics.
Yeah, I think that's crazy. And I think I just realized that there's a gap in the Harry Potter content creation space that somebody should fill. Um, it is the reaction videos to the MuggleCast podcast episodes. And
Would you know that would be crazy. But also it existed when the podcast first started. Or seriously, like so MuggleCast had a little bit of a boost because it was created by staffers at MuggleNet.
Mhm.
MuggleNet.com, biggest Harry Potter fan site in the world, was getting insane amounts of traffic. And every new MuggleCast episode was posted on the main page there. And people were going to the site looking for news of like the next book release and the next official thing,
Yeah.
and getting MuggleCast, like, what's this? Click it. Okay, we found it. So we had a huge boost. But in the beginning, in like within the first 5 episodes, there was an AOL chat room, or I guess like an AIM chat room called MuggleCast, or MuggleCast fan, it might have been. And that inspired a group of kids our age or slightly younger to do the MuggleCast fan chat cast. And it's a podcast that ran for about 13 episodes. I was a guest on maybe like their 4th or 5th episode, because I really have never said no when somebody's asked me to be on their podcast. So just let that be a lesson. Don't be so intimidated next time. But no, the MuggleCast fan chat, like, you got to understand, this is before MySpace. This is before Facebook. This is before, I think, the word meme was generally used to be,
Yeah.
I mean, to be what it means now. But there were essentially memes, there were essentially in jokes as part of, like, people were always, you could go into this AOL chat room, and if everyone left, the room would like close. But every time I went in there, it was open and there were people in there, and they were listeners of MuggleCast, and a few of them started this show that basically did talk about each episode of MuggleCast after MuggleCast, which I can't imagine. I mean, the show is long off the air, the MuggleCast fan chat cast, but I'm pretty sure I have it on a hard drive somewhere. The 13 episodes. It's very meta. It feels very strange. It's basically like when we do live events, or when we would do live events. When we were 17, 16, 15 years old, we would go to these events in these bookstores, and people would ask us, they'd come up after the podcast and ask us to sign their Harry Potter book. We're like, We
Isn't
didn't
that
write
wild?
we did not write these Harry Potter books. We have nothing to do with big fans, but they associate us
Yeah.
with, and they wanted us to sign. Of course we did. Of course we did that. But it's so wild to think that we are, because when we started it, like when I started podcasting, I wouldn't shut up. I was so insanely just passionate about Harry Potter that like anything that associated me with this thing that I loved, or anything that like, could fuel that obsession that we were letting our obsession out, was what the podcast was. The idea that anybody would like riff off of that or find enjoyment and then do their own thing, and like, but we do get that often of like, MuggleCast was the first podcast I listened to. A lot of people say that. It got me into podcasts or podcasting. We get that. And it's like, it really was one of the first podcasts. And certainly, but what we would call it today is more of one of like the first like viral podcasts. And so, yeah, it just has been wild. But there was very briefly at the sort of the first year of its existence, a reaction kind of podcast that I just had to shout out. I'm still close friends with one of the guys that was on it. And I know some of the others still. We're in touch. But yeah.
That's hilarious, and I guess not nearly as original of an idea as I thought it was.
Well, no,
but,
I mean, in
hey.
today's like YouTube, because
Yeah.
when YouTube first came out, which was after our show started, you could only do very short videos because nobody had internet, that could do high-speed video or videos up to 10 minutes or anything. Now YouTube videos, I think, are unlimited duration. So the idea of a reaction show or something like what Will Wheaton does after shows, or like Talking Dead is a show that AMC does. Like now networks are doing like reaction shows to their own shows.
Yeah.
And it's this crazy thing, but like, you're totally right that there is sort of an untapped market of like like a YouTuber or vlogger or somebody, if anybody wants to do that, that would be great. But most of the reason it hasn't existed is because we do take the time to involve audience feedback. We always have. We have always had Muggle Mail episodes where we dive into the Muggle mailbag. Our inboxes have always been open, and other ideas like other segments like Chicken Soup for the Muggle Castle, where people write in and tell us, what the podcast means and stuff, have always been a way to get your voice heard. So there hasn't been a huge need for immediate reaction things, unless a team really wanted to get together and do it, which would be real fun. But yeah, I'm certainly not calling for it.
I'm imagining the reaction video of somebody with their head in the middle, and then the chapter by chapters on each side of their head, like play one, play the other, and just like how your opinions, how your everything has changed. Anyway, somebody do that. Somebody do that. It's not going to be me. I think I might have told you this in our in some of our DM conversation, but that was actually part of the, I guess it was almost like silent confirmation for me that this podcast could even exist. Because when I was thinking about what I've been wanting to do a podcast for a decade. Cool. I used to work in radio, and
awesome.
I don't anymore. And I kind of like just missed having a microphone in my face, I think is all it really was. But as I was trying to figure out like what in the world would that even look like, and I went through all of my just insane list of things that don't make sense together, but in my brain are all the things I like. And when I landed on this, like potentially the fan reaction, the literary analysis, the like rewatch, reread type of a I guess the podcast sphere, I was like, what would it be? And so I was like whittling down what books and shows and series and stuff like that. I kind of found the theme of like, I was super late to this, I was super late to this, I was super late to and it all started coming together. But I was like, what would I talk about with Harry Potter? There's like not an original thought to be had. Could I even say anything compelling about Harry Potter as some guy that read it when he was 25? Like at this point, why would it matter? And you all had done an episode about Voldemort's Horcruxes, and I sent in an email that I'm fairly certain nobody read. But I sent in an email that was fairly lengthy about this theory that I had come up with about how um, each Horcrux hiding place was a reflection of the way that Voldemort viewed the importance of that particular Horcrux, and he
Oh.
hid it in a way that was that aligned with like what it represented to him. And I wrote it out, sent it. I didn't expect anything from it. Like I certainly wasn't. I wasn't expecting a response necessarily, but the fact that I could write it, the fact that I could think it through, the fact that I could make something that I thought was like fairly compelling and cohesive was like, oh, maybe I could talk about this. You know what I mean? Like maybe I do have something that I could bring to this fandom in my own way, and it be somewhat compelling to listen to. So it kind of was a very much a launching pad of in the pre-planning stages of this podcast being like, okay, Harry Potter can be on that list of things that you actually talk about. So,
Uh, yeah, I mean, it really does come down to everyone is their own person, right? So everyone brings something valuable to the table, period. No two opinions, opinions can be aligned, but no two opinions are the same. And certainly if you have that background in radio, you have an edge that so many people doing podcasts don't, and you'd be able to make it sound good, and you could get ahead in the podcast space.
I don't know about ahead, but I, I at least got to skip the using AirPods as my microphone stage that a lot of podcasters had to go through when they first started out.
I love this email. By the way, we have it, and I don't know if
You found
it. Yeah, I just looked it up, and and we had read it, and actually and starred it. So if it had not made it into like a Muggle Mail episode, I'm sorry, it was probably like definitely shortlisted, because
okay.
This is fantastic. This is really good. I'm gonna read this. Okay, it's called Hiding Places Theory, episode 417. Oh God.
Jesus.
May 21st, 2019. I sent
Pre-belated binge.
Yeah, belated
Didn't
binge.
exist.
I sent this on Twitter first, but then realized you probably don't check it as often. That's true. We've always been awful about social media because we predate it.
I hate social media so much.
Yeah. On episode 417, you were talking about the Locket Horcrux and why it had the amount of protections that it did. Yeah, I still wonder about that. You proposed it may have been because of what it meant to him. I think there's something to this theory, and not just for the locket. Theory in bold. Each Horcrux represented something to Voldemort and thus was reflected in its hiding place. Here are your evidence examples. The ring was Gaunt's ring and thus hidden at the Gaunt house, and that's as simple as it gets. The locket was his mother's, who left him in the orphanage and thus hidden in the cave, which he violated to some degree other children at said orphanage. The diary was a device to reopen the Chamber of Secrets and rid the School of Muggleborns, and thus was hidden with Malfoy, a follower whose main goal was to remove Muggleborns from Hogwarts. That's good. The cup was taken from a rich lady who was flaunting her own wealth, importance, heritage, and thus hidden in one of the most prominent pureblood family vaults in Gringotts amongst their jewels and ample wealth. God, that's so good. The diadem was lost and supposed to make the wearer smarter, and thus hidden in a room in which the thought was the only one smart enough to have found it at the school where lost things go, perhaps. And finally, the snake, Nagini, was a companion that was vital in keeping him alive before he had his body back, and who he may have seen as a bit of himself in, as he may have even possessed at times. Thus, he always kept her by his side under his own companionship protection. Zach, this is a gold email. This is everything we ever like to see or read from people.
Oh, that's funny. It's hilarious that you found it, and I haven't even revisited that thought process. I would have to pull it up in my own sent drafts to make it an episode on here if I was going to do it. But
did you know you actually sent us
hilarious.
another email? You sent
Did
us
I
another
really?
email. Yeah, you did. 2 years after the first one. This one is from March 27th, 2021. Hey, MuggleCast.
That's terrifying. I don't even know what this
Spin-off or
says.
fan content idea. You'll remember what this is. Had a quick idea for new content, official or unofficial. I know people don't love the career paths Canon and Cursed Child sent the trio down, but what about this? A crime drama TV series. Harry is an Auror solving crimes and mysteries, working with Hermione as she's working her way up the ministry, and maybe a plot point is convincing Ron to leave the joke shop and pursue his goal to become an Auror as well. There's 19 years post Deathly Hallows that could be explored, and plenty of life events along the way, from marriages, kids, promotions, not to mention dating a professional athlete. Hell yeah, Harry Ginny. All make good subplots while the episodes deal with solving cases, and we could end at the epilogue and give viewers the option of pretending Cursed Child doesn't exist. Love me a good crime drama. Thanks, Zach.
I do remember that now. That's funny. So I'm officially the fanboy. I was not blowing smoke up your ass. That is legit.
Yeah,
That's
you
funny
emailed
though.
us. Yeah, and even though we did not reply, which I am sorry about,
Oh, it's
we
okay.
did get it. Both emails had been read, and so whoever was managing, we really did. Usually, we like to take the time to reply or include them in Muggle Mail, but we don't get to every single one.
Of course you don't. Why would you? And that's actually what I brought you on the podcast for. Was literally to just berate you about why didn't you read my emails over the past
Oh, great.
couple of
Well, yeah, I
years?
think
Oh,
I
jeez.
fixed that. I solved that. Hopefully, it's not too little, too late.
Oh, that's so funny. Oh my gosh. All right. So the main reason I actually did, the main discussion I did want to have with you, and you alluded to this earlier before we got on the side quest of my sent folder, um, is you have been a part of this fandom since day one. You all have chronicled the fandom essentially since day one, at least since day one of audio content format be existing. Um, you are perhaps the perfect person to go through essentially the fandom as it has aged because you've been a prominent figure in it since day one. So let's start from like the literally the beginning. What was this fandom when you got in initially?
Yeah, yeah. There's parts of it I don't know, which I will say right up front. In fact, it's a real disclaimer here because there were a few years, but anecdotally and through other coverage that I have seen and read, there's a few early documentaries I'll talk about as well that kind of fill in the gaps about sort of what the fandom was early like. But Harry Potter and kind of why it is so unique, I think, to your point of very few other franchises have the same longevity and the same kind of capturing the world's attention that Harry Potter did. I mean, Harry Potter may be unique in what it was, while there are other major properties like Doctor Who, Star Wars, Star Trek, that have come out over the years, there's nothing quite like Harry Potter. There's nothing quite like the way
No.
that it inspired children to read books, especially when, the topic of conversation among inner literary circles was how nobody is reading books anymore, with the advent of the internet. And there was this fear that kids would not read books. They wouldn't sit to read a book. Either the internet or TV was getting too crazy. This was the same kind of era in the late 90s, early 2000s that blamed like the Columbine shooting on video games. People were really concerned about new media replacing old media. And, I've got to say, 20 odd years later, thank God that didn't happen. I'm glad we still have sort of a publishing industry for
Books still exist.
hard print books are still in existence for now, which is great. Print media went out of the way. There's no newspapers anymore, kind of. But
I work in advertising, man.
it's a real
Everything
problem.
has changed.
Yeah. But I think right around the time that the books were published, which is for listeners, 1997 in the UK was the first book. 1998 was the first book in the US, and the second book in the UK. So from 97, 98 onward, Harry Potter was well received among literary circles. Basically, the first people that ever read Harry Potter were children that had an aunt or an uncle or a parent that either worked in education, worked at bookstores where the books were being sold, or had heard about it through kind of word of mouth means. And this is so many people that we have heard from too have said, like, my kindergarten teacher read it to us, but you got to think like that. And that's some of those are Americans. So already my earliest touchstone here of like what fandom might have been like comes a few years in, because by the time a US school teacher reads the book to her class, so much has had to have happened to like get the book there and get the book to the
Yeah.
US and get the, so suffice to say, I don't know the earliest stuff. And I myself became a Harry Potter fan after the first movie came out in 2001. And by that point, there had been 4 books released,
Yeah.
actually 6 books, because J.K. Rowling did Quidditch Through the Ages and the original Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them books for charity, as like the school books in Harry's world. But those were done also, I think, released in 2000.
Hmm.
So J.K. Rowling was quite world known by the time and so the fandom existed. So, but how it sort of coincided with the internet really begins the journey of the story that I can tell, which is the fan sites.
Hmm.
And in 1999, Emerson Sparks, a teenager, homeschooled teenager from LaPorte, Indiana, started a site that would be MuggleNet.com. And there's a lot of you can debate like what made MuggleNet popular, what made MuggleNet, what made it the in a few short years the most trafficked site on the web for Harry Potter fans. And if I had to guess, I would still say it was the name. It's a catchy name.
It's a good one.
The
It
fact that
is.
you capitalize the N, although people still have trouble with that. And then it wasn't muggle.net,
Yeah.
mugglenet.com, is kind of something weird and funny and quirky. But yeah, it was one of many, 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 many sites. And here's the thing, is like as early as there were internet sites, like AOL was the training wheels. It was the internet on training wheels for a lot of people. It was how I
Mm-hmm.
found the internet. My family had a
Yeah.
home computer in the mid 90s, and we had AOL, and that was how I found people and how I found websites. But as early as that, there were website builders that were available to those same, I want to say, children, but really to everybody, just the public. Like Yahoo had GeoCities, and there were other such examples of really websites on training wheels.
Huh.
And then there were the children of developers. There were the people whose parents had the internet in the 80s, because the internet is absolutely from the early 80s. And email at least is from the
Yeah.
80s. You hear from there's Star Trek fans that were emailing each other in the 80s about Star Trek. So that's just the craziest thing to really think about, because the AOL was like, for me, my end, but also the explosion of like
Yeah.
America is online at that time. So the ease by which you could start your own website with little coding experience, or in the case of like Emerson, his dad was very business savvy, and so he had a leg up, and he himself was very interested in like starting a business and running like something like a website that got so much traffic and was very early on supported by like ads and things, like was right
Mm-hmm.
up his alley. And it was always going to be somebody like Emerson that started like the thing that became crazy. But the other thing is that the demand was there. The demand was there for a place, because the internet is where you go to share your interests. This is the internet is a much wider net to cast than anywhere else. Your local library is a great place to start, but if you want to meet people in different states, in different countries, even, you go to the internet, you search AOL chat rooms, you look for a Harry Potter, chat created by users, and click it and say, what do you talk about? I don't know. But back then it was IRC chats and other things. It wasn't even anything we would recognize today as being I guess it's kind of similar to like Discord now. But yeah, so early on, all I know is that there were, for a few years, we're talking 99, early 2000, there was a huge boom in Harry Potter fan sites. And at the same time, fan fiction was being written and shared. And fan fiction is not new to Harry Potter. In fact, that is largely credited with things like Star Trek in the 1960s. But it was a natural kind of output of people who read this story that resonates with them, and the story lives rent free in their brain. And so creative type people began creating the first fandom content, fan fiction, fan art, if you're artistically minded, Why not draw Harry and his friends? Why not share that on the internet? And that was possible. That was a great way to get noticed on, I think it was probably too early for like DeviantArt, but LiveJournal, and some other early sites like that hosted art. You could get well known for doing Harry Potter art even back then, well before Instagram. And another example of early fandom is Wizard Rock, which comes about in the early 2000s. But and I have more citations for that. But essentially, Harry Potter fans were congregating in the earliest 2000s, late 90s, on these Harry Potter fan sites. And the interesting thing that not a lot of people know is that Warner Brothers panicked and J.K. Rowling's people panicked because it's all about that intellectual property, that IP. So what happens is fans who love the books and want to talk about things like, say, name origins, for instance, which is like the people who had clued in to the fact that Remus Lupin is Latin for Wolfie McWolferson, wanted to talk about it. And so they'd publish whole excerpts of the books, in order to spark discussion and be like, this means this means that, kind of a thing. And even if you didn't do that, even if you didn't post large sections of the book, engaging with the content didn't mean the same thing to the rights holders back then. They were afraid of appropriation. They were protective of their new cash cow, because again, for 3 years, nothing has made them as much money in the entire publishing industry as Harry Potter. Even back then, it was so money making and so revolutionary. And the promise of 7 books coming was just absolutely insane. Like the idea that there's going to be 4 more, like so many opportunities to, line the pockets. So Harry Potter fan sites were sent cease and desists. We're talking children, 12 and 13 and 14 and 15-year-olds getting official, not made up, cease and desist from Warner Brothers saying you must cease the operation of your online website or face legal action.
And yet they still exist.
Well, that's
not
yeah.
the sites, but like that's a really, if that happened tomorrow for a fandom, call it Harry Potter over here in a completely different genre, if that happened, that fandom would be like, all right, screw you guys, I am going home. And they would stop. They just wouldn't, like, they would essentially cancel they would cancel Warner Brothers. They would cancel the series. They wouldn't buy another book. Like, it would be mass chaos. But these, like, they continued to be fans, even though the, powers that be of that thing that they're such a fan of just basically told them to shove it.
Well, not all did remain fans. Not all could keep the operation up. What eventually happened is real lawyers who were sympathetic to the fans stepped in. Because the issue mostly at play, and this is an issue that we still face today, is copyright infringement and fair use. What constitutes in the US, and I just realized, I just learned recently that this concept of fair use and this concept of copyright protection under parody law is extremely unique in the US. It is not the same everywhere. It's not the same in the UK at all. The reason we have many beloved Harry Potter things, such as a Harry Potter musical and Puffs the Play, which, was in New York for a few years in 2017 and more, and now is touring nationwide. The reason that a lot of those beloved properties exist is strictly because the same law that is still a thorn in Warner Brothers' side. So what ended up happening was eventually enough kids were traumatized and asking questions, and like some of them did have to shutter. If you get an official threatening letter from the rights holder of this book you like, how insane is that? And to be clear, like Scholastic and Bloomsbury and J.K. Rowling owned the rights, but but Warner Brothers got involved early on because they had optioned the films, and so there's also like toys and merchandise and like all that other stuff. So I don't know if it was Warner Brothers specifically that sent the C&Ds to the websites, but I think it probably was. And if you get this official looking email and you're 13, you don't want to go to jail.
No, you're shutting down
Uh,
the site.
no, you're shutting it down. You're closing it.
Yeah.
So some of those early sites that were on like GeoCities and fan pages and like early progenitors to like Squarespace and Zanga and stuff like had to be shut down. And then the ones that weren't were the people that not necessarily could even like defend themselves in court of law, but asked follow-up questions. And so there's a woman who's a fandom lawyer called Heidi Tandy, and she'd be able to tell you the whole story. But she started off at God, what was the fanfiction.net, or I think there was an earlier website than even fanfiction.net, I think, that housed and hosted Harry Potter fanfiction. And her discipline was being a lawyer. And she has throughout the years really shepherded these talks and actually been in court on both sides of the aisle about this issue of fair use. What ended up happening with the websites, just to keep things in sort of a chronological perspective, was that it became a battle that Warner Brothers changed their minds on. If you look at or think about, Harry Potter fans that are these children, it's probably not good optics that you're going after, these kids, no matter what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, because they're just passionate. But what ended up happening, certainly by the time we started our podcast in 2005, Harry Potter fan sites were actually in no small way keeping the fandom alive, because they had become homes away from home of discussion, hotbeds of discussion of the books, of the series, entire basically shrines. Every Harry Potter fan site was a shrine to that intellectual property, to that work, and kept the buzz going. There are 3 years between books, and that's a lot of time for busy people who are growing and schooling to forget about Harry Potter. Not that that would necessarily ever happen, but I think that the level of engagement that Harry Potter fans had with the source material is largely due to not just MuggleNet, but all fan sites, all of the content creators that quickly were in that space, whether it's Wizard Rock or anybody that you found, anyone that was your friend on the internet that also liked Harry Potter, kept you more engaged and kept you, let's be honest, consuming that material. And so I think probably early on that argument was made that it ultimately, the fan sites are a good thing. Now, they weren't going to go down without a fight. There are certain, by the time we did the podcast in 2005, we needed an agreement with Warner Brothers to not put the name of our podcast on t-shirts, because Muggle was a copyrighted phrase. And so even just putting MuggleCast on a t-shirt was an issue of contention. They were policing everything. They allowed MuggleNet to exist. They allowed MuggleCast to exist. They knew about us, and there was an email or two, but there were restrictions on it. And it doesn't feel good. It doesn't look good. It kind of sucks. But, this is kind of the environment that existed back then, because also many laws that are here today hadn't been written yet surrounding copyright, surrounding fair use. So again, on YouTube now, partly because YouTube videos can be like 30, whatever long. If you have copyrighted content, like clips from a movie on YouTube as part of your discussion reaction kind of video that you want to do, you can do that. You can just post the video. Everybody download the video, you insert the clips that you want, along with clips of your face on webcam, right? You can do that. That is legal now because it's commentary. It's copyright and fair use and commentary. It's transformative works is the phrase to Google. And that's allowed because there's been enough legal precedent now at this point. The people who do supercuts of like every time Snape was funny or every time Harry made a funny face. Those supercuts, also no individual commentary directly. You don't see anybody on their webcam talking about it, but the supercuts and fan videos, and Tumblr was doing this too with GIF sets, like that all still falls now under the legal, totally available category of, you know, transformative and fair use. And so the law had to catch up with how children were using the internet, is basically the main like 5 or 6 years of like way of viewing the earliest part of the fandom, because that was all going on while MuggleNet was growing in popularity, while the podcasts were starting. That was still very much that era. And Wizard Rock is going to be like my first big citation here. There's a documentary called We Are Wizards. And have you ever seen this, by the way?
I haven't, no.
Okay, it's hard to find. I'm checking it. It was listed on Amazon, but it's not on Amazon. It was listed on Vudu, but it's not on Vudu. But it was released in 2008. It's an hour and 18 minutes from let's see, Josh Corey is the director, Koury. And essentially it's a story about the first Wizard Rockers, and that, you know, they can track, they know who it was, Harry and the Potters and Draco and the Malfoys, two bands that didn't know each other, that started more or less simultaneously. I think Harry and the Potters was in the Boston area, if I'm not mistaken. But it's a story about the first Wizard Rockers, but I think it also leans into a little bit of the first people that like parents and children that go and see these types of events. And I think that's the documentary where it also talked about like the legal struggles of fan sites and cease and desist. And I think it interviews some of them. I could be wrong because it is mostly focused on the Wizard Rock, but you do get an early peek into the fandom from a outsider's perspective, from a fan's perspective, in that documentary. So it's worth tracking down somehow. Again, called We Are Wizards. But that's 2008. So that's still a few years after, you know, the fact here is like when it was happening, a lot of it was we didn't know what was happening. A lot, we can't quantify it. You know, our podcast was growing. I have theories about why, but like the first part of the fandom was really, you know, the Wild West of the internet, sort of taming the Wild West of the internet and coming together and finding what kind of content within the fandom you would consume.
It's fascinating because it's almost like you could draw a correlation or maybe just outright say that this fandom is almost responsible for a lot of what the content is that we consume on the internet outside of Harry Potter content, because react videos are like all the people literally make react videos to other YouTube videos that might even be react video. Like we could have react to react to react videos, and that stuff all like happens, and it probably doesn't without this like wave that was fought essentially in creating content on the internet within this fandom. It may not have been the only fandom doing it, but like,
right. Yeah. We didn't invent fan art, but
right.
a specific notable case of art copyright infringement that was settled or you know became law may actually affect the how the entire landscape is these days. I think there's going to be more examples of that than we can possibly track, to be honest.
Sure.
Or the other side of it is, even if it's not like what's legally available now, because people in their lives have had Harry Potter, you get a whole lot else that exists. And some of that's like it changed publishing. So the New York Times didn't track the children's literature on a separate or young adult. They didn't track sales for children separately from adult books, and Harry Potter changed that because Harry Potter was at the top of the New York Times bestseller list for flipping years. And adults were like, what the hell is this children's book doing at the top of the, like, I want to read books about communism, and I want to read books about war in Iraq, and I want to read, you know, what the hell are these? So to solve it, New York Times literally had to publish a second list that was just the bestsellers in young adult fiction. So now there's two lists or more little things like that that
Yeah.
I know Harry Potter started and was responsible for. But now it makes perfect sense to have a New York Times separate young adult list to track, because young adult fiction has absolutely exploded and
Yeah.
fantasy is back, baby. And all of it, like, really, if you think about the books that the publishing industry has heralded as, quote, the next Harry Potter, started with like Twilight and the Hunger Games and all this stuff, their success, their ability to be marketed, and their ability to be even greenlit from the publisher, is largely because there was that demand, and publishers were looking for the next big Harry Potter. Publishers, especially
Yeah.
that weren't Scholastic or Bloomsbury, were looking for what their book series that was going to go viral was. And so Harry Potter, like so many of what's common today, really does have DNA and the fingerprints of Harry Potter on it, having very little to do with necessarily with the author that wrote it. To her credit, J.K. Rowling wrote a story that was timeless, hopeful, humanist, complex, and funny.
Yeah.
And it was the right blend of genres, and it was the right blend of established sort of fantasy lore,
Mhm.
and packaged in a way that was and felt new to people. And it introduced a lot of kids not just to reading, which is the remarkable feat in and of itself,
Yeah.
because I didn't read
Oh,
before.
I still don't read.
Right, right. But Harry Potter's the exception for a lot
Yeah.
of kids, and other people that sparked writing careers, or famous fantasy authors now are crediting the Harry Potter books with inspiring them to write, or in some cases Harry Potter fan fiction became changed and made into big best-selling books in and of itself. I think or Twilight fan fiction, I'm thinking 50 Shades of Grey might have originally been Twilight fan fiction, I want to say.
I think I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, like Edward and Bella are stand-ins for Christian and whatever her name is. I haven't read or seen
I
the
have
books,
no
but
clue.
yeah, but anyway, so like examples like that, I think Harry Potter was the crucible by which a lot of what we recognize as being modern interaction with content, fan interaction with content, really started, because it was a confluence of events. It was the start of the internet, or it was the start of children on the internet,
Hmm.
and it was the start of like fan websites and things. And to our credit, if you want to go like getting into MuggleCast, I really do believe, and I want to be corrected, that MuggleCast on episode 32, which I've already talked about, started the format of chapter by chapter, of dedicating a episode of, in this case, a podcast, to a specific segmented portion of something like a book.
Hmm.
I think we were first, and because it probably existed in written form, reactions to things like Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes segments. That must have surely been kind of a thing that you can think of. But the way that people do have reaction videos now, to your point, or the
Hmm.
way that podcasts specifically have, there's movie watch podcasts, there's TV watch podcasts, and they'll do an episode of the podcast based on an episode of television, that kind of a thing.
Hmm.
I think we did it first. And so in a way, all of those shows owe it kind of to MuggleCast in a fun way. It's a way that I like to entertain myself thinking about, because we did it in early 2006, and that was right when podcasts were first started. It's hard to imagine a podcast that would have done it sooner.
Hmm.
And I think because that media existed, and the idea of like bite-sizing it out and just looking at something as robust as the Harry Potter books and going, we're going to segment it and talk about this for discussion purposes,
Hmm.
was very new, especially for people our age at the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're on one of those now. And so I guess I owe another thank you to MuggleCat, not just for showing up, but for actually creating the whole concept.
Certainly as a podcast, I think that's fair to take credit for. And then because we predate YouTube, every YouTube video that's ever been is thanks to MuggleCast as well.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah,
Every single YouTube video that has
every
ever
single
been.
one.
Every
Yeah,
single one.
I don't really believe that. Disclaimer. But But no, it's been wild because we were on the vanguard of
Yeah.
something new, and we did witness like the birth of fandom. So I don't know how many years specifically that might be said to cover from your perspective of like wanting a history of
Yeah.
Harry Potter, but that's what I got from starting. Like if I think about the early years, I think about all that stuff. Everything was new, entire mediums didn't exist, social media didn't exist, podcasts didn't exist until the early 2000s, and 2005 was when they were put on the iTunes directory, which really sold iPod podcast to the world.
Yeah.
That was like the beginning.
Nice.
A quick summary of like the last 15 years of since we ended in 2008. So is it cool if I do that?
Yeah, go for it. It's your
Okay,
podcast.
It's your podcast, sir. I'm just a guest. So if we can speeding things up a little bit, going from like 2008 when We Are Wizards happened, and the early days of Harry Potter. Oh, fan conventions is another thing. Get
Oh
me
my
on
gosh.
again to talk for hours about Harry Potter conventions.
Dude, it's it's an open door. There's no lock. I'll give you the passcode to my front door. We can do
Okay.
this anytime.
All right, where do you live? Where
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, fan conventions, yeah, the meeting places, including the Wizarding World of Harry Potter theme park that happened. There began to be spaces, both digital and physical, where fans would gather, meet. When the books were still coming out, there were midnight release parties. When the movies were out, there were midnight release parties.
People driving by, spoiling it from the windows of cars.
Yeah. That guy. But yeah, so it went pretty much the way that we're more familiar with interacting with content and media now. Where fan conventions, Comic Cons are a thing, and that all kind of also got its origin there. And as far as the podcast, I talked about how we stopped roughly around like 2014, 2015 era. But the first 100 episodes of MuggleCast took place before the last book came out. So the first 100 episodes, and it's an even number, like episode 100 was literally the show
why
in
not?
which we got the 7th book on episode 100. And it was speculation. What is going to happen? We did do some chapter by chapter in there, but most of it, like the whole context is we had just read book 6 and it came out. And so the 2 years between book 6 and book 7 are encapsulated, frozen in time capsule of the first 100 episodes of MuggleCast. And then, for the next couple of years, the movies were still coming out. We were still reporting the news of like new trailer and let's go through it and, that kind of a thing. And yeah, talk about like trailer dissection episodes and things like that. Some of the first, episodes to do that, I'm sure, were MuggleCasts. So, kind of fast forwarding, there've been a few, like I said, legal challenges over the years, and Harry Potter has not died down at all. There's more content than ever. Although I would argue subpar content with the play and unfortunately the overall direction of the movies, which I know you talked about with Juliana.
Yeah, those movies.
Yeah,
man, I wanted to love those movies.
I know, me too. The first one I think is flawless, actually. You may not feel that way, but I loved it.
I had very, very little to complain about with the first movie. When I mentioned I did like the How to Fix the Fantastic Beasts series, my notes on the first one ultimately came back to the Grindelwald part and really how the movie ended. So it wasn't really about the movie itself, it was the ending of the movie.
Yeah.
That was my big issue. I think, and I don't want to rehash everything, but I think that it would have been a much more powerful ending and a much more powerful villain character if Percival Graves was just Grindelwald and he had manipulated his way to a point of like prominence within the US wizarding government. He was just that manipulative, that charismatic, that like convincing, and it wasn't a body swap, transfiguration, polyjuice stand-in, regurgitation of something we've already seen. Like, how much more terrifying is he if he can get to that level of power in the US just by going undercover?
Fair.
As himself.
For sure. For
But
sure. And it's I think the in general too, the Fantastic Beasts sequels make the first one look worse.
yeah, they kind of do.
In certain ways, because I think in the end the balancing act that was not well done of Newt stuff versus Grindelwald stuff
Yeah.
ends up getting so, you know, careens off a cliff and tanks.
Yeah.
So even though Grindelwald is only at the end of the first film in that little last bit, and it's like, wait, what is going on right now?
Yeah.
The whole film, you can feel it like a weight that's
Yeah.
sinking the whole rest of the franchise. So anyway,
Anyway.
you know, when there, this is all to say, when there was new stuff happening, there were podcasts about it.
Yeah.
There were reaction videos that we did not do that were about it. And, you know, the whole world has seen, has had Cursed Child play near them, which, okay. And
Did you
yeah,
saw it, right? You saw the play?
it's worth seeing. It's worth seeing. There's certain special effects in the magic that I don't know how they did it, and it looked amazing.
That seems to be the consensus of multiple parties that I have heard that have gone to see it, is it's absolutely stunning to watch. I haven't seen it. I've read it, and it's hot garbage horse shit to read. I hope it's amazing to watch.
Yeah, and it's I was asked, I was talking about this to somebody recently, and she was like, does seeing it take the edge off the script?
Mm.
Because my main complaint about the script to her was the characters don't read like themselves.
No, at all.
Right, and crucially, J.K. Rowling did not write it.
Yeah.
She like authorized the story, and that's one thing that I don't think is well done at all. I don't think they found the characters' voices.
Mm.
And to a certain extent, seeing a red-headed man on stage be called Ron by everyone else on stage does soften the blow a little bit. It doesn't matter what he says out of his mouth and if it seems realistic.
Interesting.
Because that level of immersion, you know, you're very conscious that you're seeing theater. And theater already forgives in that way.
Yeah.
You can see multiple Hamlets, you can see multiple Macbeths throughout the course of your life and
Yeah.
not think anything of it, you know? So it's like that does kind of in a mystical way soften the blow, but there's still moments where line delivery is just like, or motivations, characters would never say that or never do that, or it's
Yeah.
reductive. The real problem with Cursed Child, apart from the writing, is that it panders to the lowest common denominator of Harry Potter fans. It's a who's who of everything you've ever known about Harry Potter. Bellatrix is back, Voldemort is back, Umbridge is back, time travel, shenanigans, breaking into the Ministry, everything they've literally already ever done. The Triwizard Tournament is there. You know, like it's so bad because they didn't take the time to do it right, and they didn't dare to make it a little bit more cerebral. I think the weirdest thing about Cursed Child is when it initially was announced, we're talking the thing that brought MuggleCast back on episode 270, the initial summary was something having nothing to do with Harry Potter's son getting involved in timey-wimey shenanigans and actually bringing Voldemort back and meeting his daughter. It was actually instead about Harry's relationship with his son, and kind of a very much more, if you read the initial like summary that came out, it seemed that it would actually have very low production value. It seems like it would be a play that you could do for, you know, $6,000 off Broadway somewhere. Like it really seemed like it would be this amazing character study of this boy that had been through war, that had no direction of how to parent because he himself was an orphan.
Yeah.
And I would watch the shit out of that. And at some point, the moneymakers, at some point, the shareholders got involved and they turned it into this commercially successful pile of garbage. And at a certain, and it hurts me that thousands of performances of the Cursed Child, me personally, I am hurt and I feel attacked as a Harry Potter fan and lover of these stories, that thousands of performances of this exist because it is less than what it could be. And it, you know, like it's just entertainment. If people go and are entertained, fine. But our tickets were like $430, and you got to see, we at that point you had to see it in 2 acts or no, 4 acts, 2 different parts on 2 different
Two different
nights.
days, right? Yeah.
Yeah, unless you
That's-
went on Wednesdays, which we did, where they had all 4 acts back to back with like a small lunch break. um so yeah, I mean, when new content came out, we covered it, and it's been interesting to see what, the fans have, like, their passion has ebbed and flowed, but we've just found other things to like. And then the other aspect is that people who were fans originally are having children, and they're introducing their children into Harry Potter. And so
Yeah.
you have this entire new generation. Literally, we have had, over the last 2 weeks, we've been contacted by 11, 13, and 14-year-olds that are all listening to our show. Our show is 18 years of age, and these people were not born like chapter by chapter predates these people's lives, and we're doing chapter by chapter now. So yeah, it's wild to think, but there is this cyclical nature of it all, and knowing that these stories are being revisited, not just by us, but by people finding them, like, people are always finding it for the first time, means that it really is this perpetual cycle that will continue going on until after we are all long dead.
We
the
can
world
only hope.
ends.
Or
Yeah.
But MuggleCast will still exist because, somebody else will be hosting it. You all will pass on that rights to
We
somebody.
did think, I thought it would be hilarious to find children that were born on August 7th of 2005, because they would be 18 now.
Yeah.
And to have them host an episode of MuggleCast. Like,
That would
put
be
out
hysterical.
literally the day,
Like a casting call.
Yeah, the day that we all, like, or within a month,
Yeah.
but kids from 2005 can legally vote now. Like you said, our podcast is legal adult. And
Yeah.
I want to hear from them. I want them to host a discussion that's either a carbon copy of, like, our first episode's discussion of, like, whatever news items were out that week, which was probably like a new Goblet of Fire trailer came out or something like that. Or the other idea was that, eventually one day all of our children would be hosts on the show, if we all decide to have kids. So none of us yet, I don't think so. But yeah,
not that anyone's aware of yet.
Not that we know of.
All of a sudden, the phone buzzes on the counter, and it's like, wait a minute.
Need a fact check on that.
Hey, it's Future Zach from the future when I'm editing this episode in future times. I hope you've enjoyed this Harry Potter fandom history lesson. I certainly did. Eric was so generous with his time, and we had such a great discussion when recording. I didn't want to cut anything just to make it shorter. So I'll be sharing part 2 of this conversation as we explore different aspects of the fandom as it relates to favorite characters, divisive topics, the Marauders, and some characters who were done super dirty in the books. That'll be next week's episode on the feed. In the meantime, make sure you check out Eric on MuggleCast and his personal podcast, Thank You for Spieling. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, leave a review on the podcast player you're listening on right now. And reminder, belatedbinge.com has a voicemail feature to join the discussion yourself. And there's also bonus episodes available on Patreon and links to everything you could possibly need in the show notes.